well, it's titled How Russia Helped Swing the Election for Trump. A meticulous analysis of online activity during the 2016 campaign makes a powerful case that targeted cyber attacks by hackers and trolls were decisive. That Trump would not be president, Pence would not be vice president, Betsy DeVos would not be education secretary, Phil, right on down the line, if it wasn't for a foreign government intervening in our electoral processes. And that's pretty shocking. What do we do if we have a president who's not actually our president? Chauncey DeVega is on the line with us. He's a political essayist and commentator, contributor to Salon, host of the Chauncey DeVega Show podcast. ChaunceyDeVega.com, the website. You can tweet him at Chauncey DeVega. Chauncey, it's always great having you with us. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Your most recent article over at Salon, or at least the most recent one that I've seen, is Donald Trump, Brett Kavanaugh, and Hostile Sexism, a concept that shapes our moment. And before I start digging into this, I laid a lot on the table in the setup before I brought you in. Is there any place in particular you would like to start?
Well, just thinking about what's happening in this trouble and tumult about Rosenstein and Trump firing him or not, what will happen? Folks need to keep their eye on the ball. In my podcast, I often say we have to maintain our perspective and search for a fixed point. What is this about? This is about chaos. Trump is a proto-fascist American fascist, strives on chaos. So first reports are not to be believed. And always ask yourself, I tell folks this all the time on my podcast, always ask yourself, what is the bigger picture? Trump is a human chaos engine. So folks need to take a step back and connect the dots, as you and I like to say. There was a very chilling,
Louise and I went to see Michael Moore's movie over the weekend, and there was a very chilling moment in that movie, Fahrenheit 11/9, where somebody says, there's this storm around Donald Trump, and then Moore plays this clip of Donald Trump saying, I am the storm, with this look in his eyes like, oh my God, I am the storm. And he's a one-man chaos machine. That's how he has, whatever success he's had in his life, that's how he's gotten there. So in your conversations with David Smith, you got into the multiple issues about, what motivated Trump voters, and we've had this conversation in the past, in some ways, you and I, and many others as well. That it wasn't this poor, insecure, financially insecure white people group that got Trump, that voted for Trump by and large. It was people who share his biases and his bigotry.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the narratives is these are poor, confused, white working class folks who, by the way, make on average about $73,000 a year. So they're not poor, that's for sure. And they were hoodwinked, bamboozled, confused. This is not who they really are. Well, as Sister Maya Angelou said, when someone shows you who they are, you better believe it. Yeah. These voters were conscious of what they were doing. They supported a president who's racially resentful, who's bigoted, who's violent, who's a nativist. They voted for him for those reasons, not despite it. And what this new, very, very, very essential research by David Smith and Eric Hanley, who are out of University of Kansas. What this research does very rigorously, looking at a big data set, American National Election Survey, is to say, okay, how is this connected to sexism? How is this connected to other values about rage, anxiety about, quote unquote, losing their country? And I think in this moment with Kavanaugh, with Brett Kavanaugh and America's rape culture in the White House, their concept of hostile sexism, where you have these mostly older white, both male and female, but mostly male in this case, Trump voters who are mad at women, who are upset at changing America, it was both racism and sexism that put Trump in the White House. Yeah,
and we saw this in the Anita Hill, in the way that she was treated during the Clarence Thomas hearings as well. So if Donald Trump is in the White House because of Russian involvement in the election, what do we do with that? What do we make of that? I mean, people say, oh, 25th Amendment, impeach him. But then you got Pence. Pence is there because of Russian involvement also. If this book is accurate.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a phrase that others have used, and I'm going to start using it on a recurring basis to describe the Republican Party and Trump voters, just like Vichy France with the Nazis. These are Vichy Republicans. Right? They're basically supporting a traitorous, I would argue, and treasonous Republican Party, because it's not just Trump. We have all the public evidence of Russian involvement. And this new book, is just devastating. Again, anecdotes are not data. This is very, very rigorous work looking at all the data we actually know publicly about how the Russians use Facebook and other social media to shape the information space. This is cyber warfare. So what do we do when we have an illegitimate president, because Trump is illegitimate by all accounts, never mind his behavior since getting elected. I have called, with many others, for a general strike. I think people should stop going to work. I think there should be mass disruption. There should be folks engaging in nonviolent protest. We need to make life inconvenient. And one of the ways you do that is you take your money out of the bank. Go after Trump's corporate sponsors. But the American people are so overwhelmed, so numb, they're stuck in a state of learned helplessness. And I hate to say it, and I said this on previous conversations with you here, Trump wins in 2020 if he's not impeached, because he has a diehard base of support who are part of a political cult. There's nothing this man can do. The Republicans have abandoned their responsibilities under the Constitution to provide any sort of balance to this man. And why is that? Because Trump is winning. He's doing everything that they want. And we need to emphasize that fact. This is not a disastrous president for these right-wing revanchists. He's their champion.
Yep. Yeah, he gave them the tax breaks. He's giving them the pollution, the increased corporate profits that come along with it, and all these other things. Your thoughts on Noel Francisco replacing Rod Rosenstein, if that's what happens, and or what happens if Rosenstein has been fired or quits?
Well, I mean, Mueller's already imperiled, but Mueller's a very, very smart man, and he's made sure that the states can proceed with prosecuting Trump and obviously his associates for any crimes. But as I said, the American people need to be out in mass when Mueller is gone, because if Francisco's put in there, he's just basically going to hobble it. And this is just one more example of Trump challenging, if not breaking, the guardrails of democracy, which is the rule of law. And I'll make one other observation. I've said this repeatedly. I'm actually working on a piece for Salon about this. There's this narrative that we're in a constitutional crisis. That's incorrect. We've been in a constitutional crisis since this man was elected, if not before. And again, the mainstream corporate media is so obsessed with finding normality. They're afraid to use the F word, fascism. They kept hoping that this man would pivot. They gave him billions of dollars in free advertising. We've been in a crisis for 2 years, and it's only going to get worse. I
would submit to you, Chauncey, that we have been in a constitutional crisis, absolutely, since 1968. Since the year that Richard Nixon reached out to the South Vietnamese and said, if you will refuse to go along with the peace deal that LBJ has worked out with you successfully, now this was in August of 1968, if you will refuse to go along with this deal, I will make you rich. And they said, okay, cool. And they refused to go along with the deal, and the war went on for years, and Richard Nixon became president. And it's the only reason that he was able to beat Hubert Humphrey is because he could shoot that down. And then again, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan's campaign made a deal, Bill Casey made a deal with the Ayatollah, and now we have the former president of Iran, who was the president at that time, Bonnie Sauter, who in the Christian Science Monitor just coming right out and saying, Ronald Reagan cut a deal with the Ayatollahs. I know about it. I was there. They were there. And that's how he beat Jimmy Carter. And then you've got in 2000, George W. Bush, his brother knocking 60, 70, 80,000 African Americans off the voting rolls in Florida to get him within spitting distance of the election. And then a year later, when the vote is actually counted, we discover that the Supreme Court, which stopped the recount in Florida, had that recount continued across the entire state, that Al Gore actually won the election. I mean, I think that we have been so up to our eyeballs in constitutional crisis since the Republicans decided in 1968 that the law doesn't matter, treason doesn't matter. This is just the logical extension of it all.
Well, I mean, as Noam Chomsky famously said, this is a corporate democracy. All right. This is not a real people's democracy. And looping back to Michael Moore's new documentary, there's great research. I think it's probably one of the most important pieces of research in the last decade, if not 20 years. Larry Bartels, Martin Gillens out of Yale, looking at how elites in this country elected elites totally ignore the average American. Yeah. In Michael Moore's documentary, you can go across from gun control to health care to extending health care for all, the environment, cutting back this grotesque military budget, tax policy. The Republican Party and the Democrats are wholly ignoring the wishes of the American people. The American people are not center, right, or conservative. The American people are we, the people, progressive liberals. Yeah. Right? They have a real view of what democracy should be, but the Republicans and the corporate Democrats ignore them. So this country wasn't a democracy at the time of the founding. We're a democracy in progress, and we certainly have been derailed in the last 50 years. Yeah, absolutely. And this is the essence of the study out of Northwestern University that Page and Gillens did. We had, I forget if it was Page or Gillens, but we had one of them on the show back a couple of years ago when this came out, where they looked at, I believe it was since the 1980s, it might be more recently, but they looked at
public opinion versus what kind of legislation gets passed. And they found that the interests and desires of the top 5%, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong on this.
Yep, that's absolutely, yep.
Yeah, the interests and desires of the top 5% were predictably enacted into law, something like on the order of 70-some-odd% of the time. Whereas the interests and desires of the bottom 95% of Americans, the probability of those being translated into law were statistically equivalent to random noise. In other words, nobody's listening, right, in the political class. And this is a terrible thing. We've got to take our democracy back. Chauncey DeVega, chaunceyDeVega.com is the website. You can tweet him at Chauncey DeVega. Check out his podcast. It's great. And his most recent piece is in Salon. Chauncey, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Always great talking with you.